In a vast expanse of the Galactic Council's jurisdiction, where 1,000 species dance the delicate ballet of interstellar politics, one simple act of kindness would reshape the very foundations of cosmic law. What happens when an alien's compassion toward 3 desperate human children becomes the catalyst that exposes the deepest corruption in galactic civilization? When mercy becomes rebellion and love becomes revolution, the universe discovers that humanity's greatest weapon was never their technology or their fury. It was their ability to inspire others to become more than they ever thought possible. This is the story of HFY, a gentle soul for the crystalline world of Zephyria, who made a choice that would echo across the stars for generations. It's the story of 3 abandoned human children who grew up to become something unprecedented. And it's the story of how the most powerful beings in the galaxy learned to fear not human strength, but human heart. The twin sons of Kepler, 442b, cast long shadows across the abandoned industrial district as HFY made his way through the maze of rusted shipping containers. His crystalline skin caught the amber light, reflecting it in gentle patterns that danced across the metal walls around him. As a mineral rights inspector for the Galactic Council, he had seen many dying worlds, but something about this particular human colony struck him as especially tragic. The evacuation had been swift and merciless. When the mining consortium decided the planet's resources weren't profitable enough to maintain a permanent settlement, they had given the colonists exactly 72 standard hours to pack their lives and leave. Most had complied, boarding the transport ships with whatever they could carry. But HFY knew from experience that some always got left behind. His scanner beeped softly, indicating elevated life signs ahead. HFY frowned, adjusting the device with one of his 4 delicate fingers. According to his records, this sector should have been completely evacuated 3 days ago. Perhaps some wildlife had moved into the abandoned structures, or maybe his equipment was malfunctioning again. The Council's budget for inspector equipment had been cut significantly this cycle. As he rounded the corner of a collapsed prefab building, HFY heard something that made his primary heart skip a beat. Crying. Soft, muffled sobbing that could only come from a sentient being in distress. He quickened his pace, his elongated legs carrying him swiftly toward the source of the sound. Behind an overturned cargo hauler, partially hidden by scattered debris, he found them. 3 human children, huddled together in a makeshift shelter constructed from salvaged metal sheets and torn fabric. The youngest, a girl who couldn't have been more than 6 standard years old, was curled up between 2 older boys. One looked to be perhaps 10, the other maybe 12. All 3 were painfully thin, their clothes torn and dirty, their faces streaked with grime and tears. HFY's secondary heart began beating rapidly, a biological response his species experienced when confronted with young beings in danger. He approached slowly, not wanting to frighten them further. "Hello, little ones," he said softly, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones characteristic of his people. "Eom HFY? Are you hurt?" The oldest boy immediately moved protectively in front of his siblings, his small fists raised despite his obvious weakness. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice cracked with fear and exhaustion. "We're not doing anything wrong." HFY knelt down, making himself appear smaller and less threatening. His species had evolved from gentle herbivores, and their body language typically conveyed peace, but he understood that these children had likely never seen a Zephyrian before. "I mean you no harm," HFY said, slowly reaching into his supply pack and retrieving a nutrition bar. "You must be hungry. What did you last eat?" The youngest girl's eyes fixed on the food with desperate longing, but the older boy still held his protective stance. "We don't need your help," he said, though his voice was weaker now. "Our mom and dad are coming back for us. They had to go get supplies." HFY's linguistic training allowed him to detect the lie in the boy's words. But more than that, his centuries of life experience told him the truth. These children had been abandoned, either deliberately or through some terrible circumstance during the evacuation. The colony record would tell him more, but that could wait. "What are your names?" he asked gently, placing the nutrition bar on the ground between them and backing away slightly. The youngest girl whispered something to the older boy. After a moment of internal struggle, he lowered his fists. "I'm Marcus," he said. "This is Elena, and that's David." He pointed to the middle child, who had been silent throughout the exchange. "It is an honor to meet you, Marcus, Elena, and David," Kethvar said, performing the traditional Zephyrian greeting gesture, which involved touching his chest with all four hands. "How long have you been here alone?" "For days," Elena said in a small voice, speaking for the first time. "Maybe 5. I lost count." Kethvar's Hodge Klinfit. 4 days without proper food or water in the bitter nights of this world. It was a miracle they were still alive. He began to understand the magnitude of what had happened here. In the chaos of the evacuation, these 3 children had somehow been overlooked, forgotten, left behind like discarded cargo. The ships. Marcus began, then stopped himself. "Tell me about the ships," Kethvar encouraged. "Mom said she was going to get our documentation fixed. She told us to wait by the loading dock. But when the last ship came, they said they had no record of us. The man with the clipboard, he said we weren't on the manifest. They wouldn't let us on." Marcus's voice broke slightly. "Mom never came back." The picture became clearer to Kethvar. Bureaucratic oversight, the kind that happened all too often when the council authorized rapid evacuations. Someone had made an error in the paperwork, and these children had fallen through the cracks. Their parents might have been processed separately, might have been told their children were already safely aboard another transport. In the confusion and haste, nobody had verified the information. "Are you going to turn us into the authorities?" David asked suddenly. His voice was different from his siblings, carrying a hardness that seemed far too mature for his apparent age. "Because we're not going to the processing centers. We've heard what happens there." Kethvar had indeed heard about the human processing centers, and the knowledge made him uncomfortable. The Galactic Council's policy toward displaced human populations had become increasingly harsh in recent decades. Children without proper guardianship were often placed in institutional facilities that were, by any reasonable definition, little better than prisons. The humans called them reformation centers, places where young beings were supposedly prepared for integration into galactic society. In reality, they were designed to strip away human cultural identity and produce compliant workers for the Council's various projects. "I'm not going to turn you in," Kethvar said firmly. "But you cannot stay here. This world is being handed over to the Hegarian Mining Collective tomorrow. They will strip the atmosphere for processing, and nothing will be able to survive on the surface." The children exchanged glances. Elena began to cry again, soft whimpering sounds that cut through Kethvar's soul like shards of broken crystal. "We have nowhere to go," Marcus said, his protective facade finally cracking. "Even if we could get off planet, we don't have identity documentation. We don't have credits. We don't have anything." Kethvar stood up slowly, his mind racing. There were protocols for situations like this, official channels he was supposed to follow. But every instinct in his body rebelled against the thought of delivering these children to the Council's mercy. He had seen too many species broken by the system's indifference, too many young beings ground up in the machinery of galactic bureaucracy. "You have me," he said quietly. Marcus looked up at him with confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I'm going to take you away from here. I'm going to find you somewhere safe to live, somewhere you can grow up properly. It may not be easy, and it may not be comfortable, but you will be alive, and you will be free." "You would do that?" David asked, suspicion still evident in his voice. "Why? What do you get out of it?" Kethvar considered the question seriously. In his culture, the protection of young beings was not seen as optional or transactional. It was simply what civilized beings did. But he understood that humans, having been subjected to decades of exploitation by the Council, had learned to be wary of seemingly generous offers. "On my world," he explained, "there is a saying. The crystal that shares its light grows brighter. Your species may not know this, but Zephyrians measure wealth not in credits or possessions, but in the positive impact we have on other lives. By helping you, I helped myself become the being I wish to be. Elena had stopped crying and was watching him with wide, hopeful eyes. Marcus still looked skeptical, but David was nodding slowly. Where would we go? Marcus asked. Humans aren't exactly welcome in most places. My homeworld, Kethvar said. Zephyria. It is a peaceful place, far from the main trade routes. The council has little influence there, and my people value diversity. You would be safe while we figure out a more permanent solution. And you would just adopt us? David asked. Even though we're not your species? Family is not determined by genetics, Kethvar replied. Family is determined by choice and commitment. If you are willing to trust me, I am willing to make that choice. Marcus looked at his siblings, then back at Kethvar. What about our parents? What if they're looking for us? I will file reports with every appropriate agency, Kethvar promised. If your parents are alive and searching for you, we will find them. But first, we need to get you away from here before this planet becomes uninhabitable. The sound of approaching engines interrupted their conversation. In the distance, Kethvar could see the lights of the Hegarian advance team, beginning their preliminary sweep of the evacuation zone. In a few hours, they would start releasing atmospheric processing chemicals that would make the air toxic to most forms of life. We need to leave now, he said urgently, beginning to pack his equipment. Can you walk? Do you have anything you need to take with you? Elena pointed to a small stuffed animal partially buried under their makeshift shelter. Just Patch, she said. He's my bear. David retrieved the toy and handed it to his sister, then helped Marcus to his feet. All three children were unsteady, weakened by days of hunger and exposure, but they managed to stand. Stay close to me, Kethvar instructed, leading them toward his inspection vehicle. And do not worry. Whatever happens next, you are not alone anymore. As they walked through the abandoned colony toward his ship, Kethvar felt a strange sensation he had never experienced before. He was breaking multiple council regulations, potentially jeopardizing his career and his standing in galactic society. He was taking on responsibility for 3 members of a species that many considered primitive and dangerous. He was acting on pure instinct and emotion rather than logic and protocol, and yet he had never felt more certain about anything in his life. Behind them, the lights of the Hegarian mining ships grew brighter, sweeping across the empty buildings and discarded possessions of a failed human colony. Ahead, Kethvar's modest inspection vessel waited, its cargo hold modified for long-range travel. It would be cramped quarters for 4 beings, but it would do. As he helped the children aboard and began the launch sequence, Kethvar allowed himself a moment to consider what he was really doing. He was not just saving 3 human children from an ugly death. He was choosing to believe that compassion could triumph over bureaucracy, that individual action could matter in a galaxy that seemed increasingly indifferent to suffering. The ship lifted off into the amber sky of Kepler 442b, carrying its unlikely family toward a future none of them could possibly imagine. In the years to come, Kethvar would often look back on this moment as the point when his life truly began. He had spent centuries following rules and fulfilling obligations. Now, finally, he was following his heart. As the planet fell away below them and the stars opened up ahead, Elena fell asleep clutching her stuffed bear, while Marcus and David stared out the viewport in wonder. They had never been in space before, had never seen their world from this perspective. For the first time in days, they looked like children again instead of survivors. Kethvar set the navigation system for Zephyria and settled in for the long journey home. He had no idea that the simple act of compassion he had just performed would eventually reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. He only knew that he had 3 young beings depending on him, and he would not let them down. The ship entered hyperspace with a gentle shudder, carrying its precious cargo toward a destiny that would astonish the universe. 7 years had passed since Kethvar brought the 3 human children to Zephyria, and the crystal gardens of his family compound had never been more alive with laughter and chaos. What had once been a place of serene meditation had been transformed into something resembling a cross between a training ground and a playground, complete with climbing structures adapted for human physiology and reinforced crystal formations that could withstand the remarkable destructive creativity of growing humans. Elena, now 13, hung upside down from one of the garden's bioluminescent trees, her dark hair streaming toward the ground as she practiced the advanced acrobatic techniques that Kethvar's cousin Lethnari had been teaching her. Her human flexibility, combined with Zephyrian grace training, had produced a style of movement that was uniquely her own and absolutely mesmerizing to watch. Elena, your form is excellent, but remember to keep your core engaged during the transition, called Lethnari, whose own crystalline body caught the light of Zephyria's 3 moons as she demonstrated the proper technique. Your human spine is more flexible than ours, but it's also more vulnerable. I know, Elena replied, executing a perfect flip that would have been impossible for most Zephyrian younglings. But humans are built for this kind of stuff. David says it's because we evolved from tree-dwelling primates. Across the garden, 17-year-old Marcus was engaged in an intense discussion with 3 adult Zephyrians about the mathematical principles underlying their crystal growth technology. His human mind, it had turned out, was particularly suited to the kind of nonlinear thinking required for advanced crystallography. While Zephyrians intuitively understood how their technology worked, Marcus could explain the underlying quantum mechanics in ways that even surprised the engineers. The harmonic resonance frequency you're using is creating interference patterns in the tertiary matrix, Marcus was saying, gesturing animatedly with hands that were now stained with the silvery residue of crystal cultivation. If you adjust the base frequency by approximately 0.3 terahertz and introduce a phase shift here, he pointed to a section of the growing crystal structure, you should be able to increase growth efficiency by at least 15%. Elder Mothkarai, one of the most respected crystallographers on Zephyria, examined Marcus's calculations with growing amazement. In 3 centuries of crystal cultivation, I never considered this approach. Your human perspective sees patterns that we miss entirely. Meanwhile, 19-year-old David sat cross-legged in the center of the garden's meditation circle, surrounded by a dozen Zephyrian younglings who were hanging on his every word as he told them stories about Earth's ancient mythologies. His voice had deepened over the years, and he had inherited his father's talent for storytelling, though his tales were far more exotic to his audience than anything their own culture could produce. And then Odysseus had to choose between Scylla and Charybdis, David continued, his eyes bright with the passion of a natural teacher. It's a human saying now, when you have to choose between 2 terrible options. But the story teaches us that sometimes the bravest choice is not the one that avoids all danger, but the one that accepts risk in service of a greater good. Young Kithmela, barely past her first crystal budding, raised one delicate hand. But, David, why didn't Odysseus just find a 3rd option? Surely there was another way home. David smiled, an expression that had become familiar and beloved to the Zephyrian children. That's exactly the right question, Kithmela, and maybe there was another way. But sometimes when you're in the middle of a storm, you can only see the choices directly in front of you. The wisdom comes later when you look back and understand what you've learned from making the hard decisions. Kethvar watched his adopted children from the entrance to the garden, feeling a complex mixture of pride, love, and growing concern. In 7 years, Marcus, Elena, and David had become more than just part of his family. They had become integral to Zephyrian society in ways that no one had anticipated. Marcus's innovations in crystal technology were already being implemented across 3 industrial sectors. Elena's unique movement style had inspired a new form of artistic expression that was spreading throughout the planet. David's storytelling and philosophical insights had begun influencing how young Zephyrians thought about ethics and decision-making. They had become, in effect, cultural ambassadors for their entire species, proving to the Zephyrians that humans were not the primitive, violent beings that Galactic Council propaganda portrayed them as. But that success was also what worried Kethvar. "They're extraordinary," said a voice behind him. Kethvar turned to see his life mate, Sephrina, approaching with a data tablet in her hands and concern written across her crystalline features. "But that may be exactly the problem." "You received word from the council?" Kethvar asked, though he already knew the answer from her expression. "The annual inspection report came back with some troubling additions," Sephrina said, handing him a tablet. "It seems that word of our human integration experiment has reached the attention of certain influential council members. They're requesting detailed information about the children's activities, their education, their social integration. They want biometric data, psychological profiles, and genetic samples." Kethvar's primary hearts began beating faster as he scanned the official documentation. The language was bureaucratic and seemingly neutral, but he had spent enough time working within the council systems to understand the subtext. This was not a routine inquiry. This was the beginning of something much more serious. "They cannot have them," he said quietly but firmly. "Marcus, Elena, and David are not experimental subjects. They are my children, and they are Zephyrian citizens under the adoption accords of 2387. "Legally, yes," Sephrina agreed. "But the council has ways of reinterpreting legal frameworks when it suits their purposes. They could claim that human integration represents a security risk, or that the children require specialized education that only council facilities can provide. They could argue that keeping them here is actually a form of abuse, since we're supposedly depriving them of contact with their own species." Across the garden, Elena dropped down from her tree and began teaching one of the younger Zephyrians how to perform a cartwheel. The sight of her patience and gentleness with the struggling child made Kethvar's secondary hearts ache. She had grown into exactly the kind of being he had hoped she would become. Confident, kind, brilliant, and completely integrated into their community. "Have you told them about this?" Sephrina asked. "Not yet, but I will have to soon. They deserve to know what may be coming." Marcus had apparently finished his discussion with the crystallographers and was walking over to join Elena's impromptu gymnastics lesson. As Kethvar watched, his eldest adopted son effortlessly lifted one of the smaller Zephyrian children onto his shoulders, spinning around slowly while the youngster giggled with delight. The casual display of strength and playfulness was so naturally human, and yet it fit perfectly into the gentle rhythms of Zephyrian family life. "There's something else," Sephrina said hesitantly. "The inquiry specifically mentions David's storytelling activities. They seem particularly concerned about his influence on young Zephyrian cognitive development. They're calling it unauthorized cultural modification of a protected species." Kethvar felt a cold crystal of fear form in his stomach. "They're treating us like children who cannot make our own decisions about our cultural evolution." "Which is exactly how the council has always treated smaller worlds," Sephrina pointed out. "The only reason Zephyria has maintained its independence is because our crystal technology is too valuable for them to risk destabilizing us. But if they can frame human presence here as a threat to our autonomy..." The implication hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. The council could argue that human influence was corrupting Zephyrian society, making them less reliable as allies and trading partners. They could position themselves as protectors of Zephyrian cultural purity, even as they used that justification to extend their control over the planet. "Kethvar!" David's voice interrupted his dark thoughts. The young man had apparently noticed their serious conversation and approached with the perceptiveness that had always characterized him. "Is everything all right?" Looking at David now, Kethvar was struck by how much he had grown. At 19, he was nearly as tall as Kethvar himself, with the lean build and calloused hands of someone who spent his time working with his mind and his body in equal measure. His eyes held a maturity that came from overcoming early trauma, but also a warmth that spoke to the healing power of unconditional love. "We need to talk," Kethvar said. "All of us. There are some things you need to know." Elena performed one final flip and landed gracefully beside them, while Marcus concluded his conversation with the crystallographers and joined their growing circle. The three humans looked at their adoptive parents with expressions that were simultaneously apprehensive and trusting. They had learned, over the years, that serious conversations in the HFY household typically led to positive outcomes, even when they began with difficult news. "The Galactic Council has taken notice of you," HFY began without preamble. "They want to study you to understand how human children develop when raised in an alien environment. They claim it is for scientific purposes, but I believe their real motivation is political. They want to take us away," Elena said. "It wasn't a question. They want to try," Sefrina corrected. "Whether they succeed depends on many factors, including how we choose to respond to their inquiries." Marcus frowned, his analytical mind already working through the implications. "What kind of legal standing do we have? Are we considered Zephyrian citizens, human refugees, or council wards?" "Officially, you are Zephyrian citizens with full legal protections under our adoption laws," HFY explained. "But the council could argue that my original adoption of you was improper, since I didn't go through their formal refugee processing system. They could claim that you were essentially kidnapped from council jurisdiction, making your citizenship status invalid." "But that's ridiculous," David protested. "We were abandoned on a dead planet. If you hadn't found us, we would have died. There was no council jurisdiction to respect." Logic and law do not always coincide, especially when political interests are involved, Sefrina said gently. "The council has been looking for ways to expand their influence over worlds like ours for decades. Your presence here gives them a potential opening." Elena had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up with a voice that was steady despite her young age. "So what do we do? Do we run? Do we hide? Do we fight?" "We have some options," HFY said. "We could attempt to resolve this through diplomatic channels, working with the Zephyrian government to formally protest the Council's inquiry. We could seek support from other independent worlds that have similar concerns about Council overreach. Or, Marcus prompted, "or we could find a way to make you too valuable for the Council to risk alienating. If your contributions to Zephyrian society become significant enough, if your integration becomes a symbol of successful interspecies cooperation, then removing you could be seen as a destabilizing action that other worlds might use as justification for their own resistance to council authority." David was shaking his head. "That makes us into political pawns, whether we want to be or not. And it puts Zephyria at risk of retaliation." "You are already political pawns," Sefrina pointed out sadly. "The moment the council decided to take an interest in you, you became symbols. The question is whether you become symbols of council authority or symbols of resistance to that authority." The group fell silent for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Around them, the crystal gardens continued their eternal slow dance of growth and change, bioluminescent patterns shifting in response to the emotional states of the beings within them. Tonight, the patterns were more chaotic than usual, reflecting the uncertainty and tension that had suddenly entered their peaceful world. "I won't go back," Elena said finally. "I won't let them put me in some institution where they can study me like a laboratory animal. This is my home. You are my family. If they want me, they'll have to take me by force. And if they try that, they'll have to go through us," Marcus added, his voice carrying a determination that surprised everyone with its intensity. "We're not children anymore, and we're not helpless. We've learned things here, developed skills that even the council might find difficult to deal with." HFY looked at his adopted children with a mixture of pride and terror. They had grown into remarkable young beings, but they were still so young, still so vulnerable despite their newfound confidence. The idea of them standing against the full power of the Galactic Council filled him with protective rage. "There may be another way," he said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "But it would be dangerous, and it would require all of us to be willing to take significant risks." "Tell us," David said simply. "The Council's authority depends on the consent of the member worlds. They maintain power by convincing everyone that their system is necessary, that without their oversight, the galaxy would collapse into chaos and war. But What if we could demonstrate that their system is not only unnecessary, but actively harmful? You're talking about exposing their corruption, Marcus said, understanding immediately. Using our situation as a case study in how they prioritize political control over the welfare of sentient beings. Exactly. But it would mean making our story public, accepting that we would become the center of a galactic political controversy. And it would mean gathering evidence of other instances where the Council has prioritized politics over justice. Sephrina was looking at her life mate with growing concern. Kethvar, what you're suggesting is essentially sedition. If we're wrong, if we can't prove our case conclusively, we could all face charges of conspiracy against the Galactic Order. And if we're right? Elena asked. If we're right, we might help create a future where beings like you are protected by law instead of being victimized by it, Kethvar replied. Where adoption across species lines is celebrated instead of treated as suspicious. Where diversity is seen as strength instead of as a threat to stability. David stood up suddenly, pacing to the edge of the meditation circle and back. How long do we have to decide? The Council has given us 30 standard days to comply with their information request, Sephrina said. After that, they'll likely move to more coercive measures. Then, we use those 30 days, Marcus said decisively. We research, we gather evidence, we build our case. And if we can't find enough proof of corruption to make our story compelling, then we reconsider our options. Are you sure? Kethvar asked. Once we start down this path, there may be no going back. The Council does not forgive those who challenge their authority. Elena moved to stand beside Marcus, slipping her hand into his in a gesture of solidarity that dated back to their earliest days as siblings. We've been running from authority figures our whole lives, she said. Maybe it's time to stand and fight instead. David joined them, completing the triangle of human determination that had seen them through every crisis of their young lives. Kethvar, you saved us when we were completely powerless. You gave us a home, a family, an education, and a future. Now maybe we can save you, and everyone else who believes that compassion should be stronger than politics. Looking at his children, standing together in the soft glow of the crystal gardens, Kethvar felt something shift inside his chest. For 7 years, he had been their protector, their guide, their source of stability. Now, suddenly, they were proposing to become his partners in something far more significant than family life. All right, he said quietly. 30 days to gather evidence. 30 days to build a case that could change how the galaxy thinks about justice and family and the rights of all sentient beings. Are we all committed to this path? 3 human voices and 2 Zephyrian voices spoke in unison. Yes. Above them, the 3 moons of Zephyria continued their ancient dance, casting shifting patterns of light across the garden where a new kind of family had just decided to challenge the most powerful institution in the known galaxy. In the distance, the first transport ships of the morning were beginning their daily journeys to the orbital stations, carrying the products of Zephyrian industry to countless worlds. None of the travelers aboard those ships could have imagined that their peaceful stopover world was about to become the center of a revolution that would reshape interstellar civilization. But then again, the most important changes often began in the most unlikely places with the most ordinary acts of love and courage. 23 days into their investigation, Marcus stood in the center of what had once been Kethvar's peaceful study, surrounded by enough documentation to build a legal case against half the Galactic Council. Holographic displays filled the air around him, showing interconnected webs of corruption, abuse, and systematic oppression that stretched across dozens of star systems and hundreds of years. "This is bigger than we thought," he said, rubbing his eyes with hands that trembled slightly from too much caffeine and too little sleep. "It's not just about adoption policies or human rights. The Council has been systematically destabilizing smaller civilizations for centuries, using refugee crises as justification for intervention, then never leaving once they've established control." Elena looked up from her own workstation, where she had been cross-referencing shipping manifests with refugee transport records. Her acrobatic training had given her an unexpected advantage in data analysis. She could mentally manipulate complex, three-dimensional information structures in ways that impressed even Marcus's mathematical mind. "Look at this pattern," she said, gesturing to a holographic timeline that showed refugee movements across the past 50 years. Every single major displacement event happens to coincide with the discovery of valuable resources in the affected system. The timing is too precise to be coincidental. David was pacing behind them both, his role as the family storyteller having evolved into something like a strategic communications coordinator. He had been working on ways to present their findings that would be comprehensible to beings from dozens of different species, each with their own cultural biases and communication styles. "We need to be careful about how we frame this," he said. "If we come across as conspiracy theorists, no one will listen to our evidence. But if we're too cautious, the impact will be lost in bureaucratic language that nobody remembers." Sefrina entered the study carrying a tray of nutrition supplements and stimulants, her crystalline features reflecting the stress that had been building in their household over the past 3 weeks. "Any luck reaching Dr. Euthandra? She's agreed to speak with us, but only through encrypted channels and only after verifying our identities through 3 separate security protocols," Marcus replied. Apparently, her research into Council psychiatric institutions has made her some powerful enemies. Dr. Euthandra was an Altarian xenopsychologist whose preliminary studies had suggested that the Council's reformation centers were causing permanent psychological damage to their subjects. Her work had been suppressed and her funding revoked, but rumors suggested she had continued her research in secret, documenting cases that would support their emerging theory about the Council's true agenda. Kethvar materialized in the doorway with his characteristic silent movement, his primary hearts visibly beating with the stress of the past weeks. "I have news from the Government Council," he said, "both good and concerning." "Tell us," Elena said, pausing her data analysis. "The good news is that Chancellor Vethmaran has agreed to review our preliminary findings and consider supporting a formal challenge to the Council's authority. The concerning news is that we have less time than we thought. Council enforcement has moved up their timeline. They'll be arriving in 6 days, not 7. That doesn't give us enough time to complete the analysis," Marcus protested. "We've identified 47 separate incidents that support our case, but we need to verify sources, cross-reference testimonies, and build a coherent narrative structure. 6 days isn't enough." "Then we work with what we have," David said decisively. "Sometimes you have to tell the story with incomplete information and trust that the truth will emerge from the telling." A soft chime indicated an incoming encrypted communication. Marcus quickly activated the security protocols, and the study filled with the flickering image of Dr. Euthandra. The Altarian scientist appeared to be broadcasting from some kind of underground facility, her usual academic composure replaced by obvious fear and determination. "I cannot speak for long," she said without preamble, "but I understand you're investigating Council adoption and refugee policies. I have information that may be relevant to your case." "We're listening," Kethvar said. 3 years ago, I was contracted by the Council to conduct psychological evaluations of human children in their reformation centers. What I found was systematic abuse designed not to rehabilitate, but to break the children's connection to their own cultural identity. They were being programmed, essentially, to become compliant workers with no memory of their origins and no capacity for independent thought. Elena had gone very still, her face pale. "How many children?" "Thousands. Across 17 different facilities. Human children, primarily, but also young beings from other species that the Council considers problematic. The Kavari, the Threnodidae, several others. All undergoing the same process of cultural erasure and psychological conditioning." Marcus was recording everything, his analytical mind automatically cataloging the information for integration with their existing evidence. "Do you have documentation?" "Some. enough to prove that the Council's public statements about humanitarian aid are directly contradicted by their actual practices. But the moment I tried to publish my findings, I was accused of academic fraud, and my research credentials were revoked. I've been in hiding ever since. Would you be willing to testify before the Zephyrian Council? Kethvar asked. We're preparing a formal challenge to the Council's authority in our case, and your expertise could be crucial. Dr. Youthandra was quiet for several moments, clearly struggling with the decision. If I do this, there's no going back. The Council will brand me as a traitor, and I'll never be able to return to legitimate academic work. If you don't do this, thousands of children will continue to suffer the kind of abuse you've documented, David said gently. And our family will probably be separated, with Marcus, Elena, and myself becoming the next subjects in their reformation programs. You're the 3 human children that Inspector Kethvar adopted, she realized. I've heard about your case. Your integration into Zephyrian society has been remarkably successful, which is precisely what terrifies the Council. You represent proof that their methods are not only unnecessary, but counterproductive, which is why they want to study us, Elena said. Not to learn how to improve their programs, but to understand what went wrong with their theory that humans are inherently dangerous and unassimilable. Exactly. Your very existence challenges the fundamental assumptions that justify their entire approach to refugee management and cultural assimilation. Dr. Youthandra paused, then nodded decisively. I'll do it. I'll testify. But I need guarantees of protection for myself and my research staff. Zephyria does not extradite political refugees, Sephrina assured her. If you can reach our system safely, we can offer you asylum while this situation is resolved. After Dr. Youthandra disconnected, the family spent several hours integrating her information with their existing research. The picture that emerged was even more damning than they had initially suspected. The Council wasn't simply pursuing misguided policies. They were actively engaging in what could only be described as cultural genocide, systematically destroying the identities of entire populations under the guise of humanitarian assistance. The question now, Marcus said, as they prepared to present their findings to the Zephyrian government, is whether our evidence is strong enough to convince other worlds to take action. Documenting the crimes is only the first step. Creating political consequences is much more difficult. That's where our story becomes crucial, David replied. Facts and statistics are important, but they don't create emotional investment. People need to understand not just what the Council is doing, but why it matters on a personal level. They need to see us not as political symbols, but as a family fighting for the right to stay together. Elena had been quiet during this exchange, but now she looked up from her data analysis with an expression of grim determination. I've been thinking about something Dr. Youthandra said, about how our existence challenges the Council's assumptions about human nature. What if that's exactly the approach we should take? What do you mean? Kethvar asked. Instead of just presenting evidence of Council corruption, what if we actively demonstrate the alternative? What if we show the galaxy what successful interspecies adoption looks like, what humans are capable of when they're raised with love and respect instead of fear and control? Marcus was nodding slowly. A positive proof instead of just a negative one. Show them what we've accomplished, what we've contributed to Zephyrian society, what we've learned about cooperation and innovation. And then challenge them to explain why the Council's approach is supposedly superior, David added. Make them defend their methods instead of forcing us to defend our right to exist. Sephrina was looking at the 3 humans with growing amazement. You're proposing to put yourselves on trial, essentially. To make your entire lives the evidence in a case against the galaxy's most powerful institution. We're already on trial, Elena pointed out. The only question is whether we're passive defendants or active prosecutors. That evening, as they prepared for the next day's presentation to the Zephyrian Council, Kethvar found himself standing in the crystal garden where he had first explained the situation to his adopted children. The bioluminescent plants responded to his emotional state, casting patterns of deep blue and silver that reflected his mixture of pride and terror. Second thoughts? Sephrina asked, joining him among the glowing trees. Many thoughts, he replied. I keep thinking about that day, 7 years ago, when I found them on Kepler 442b. 3 terrified, starving children who had been abandoned by the system that was supposed to protect them. I thought I was just saving their lives. You did save their lives, and they've used those lives to become something extraordinary. But now they're proposing to risk everything they've built, everything they've become, to challenge the same system that abandoned them in the first place. What if I've simply given them more to lose? Sephrina was quiet for several moments, watching the light patterns shift across the garden. Do you remember what you said to me the night you brought them home? When I asked you why you had taken such a risk, I said that some risks are worth taking because the alternative is accepting that compassion has no place in a civilized society. And has anything changed? Are Marcus, Elena, and David choosing to fight for any different reason than the one that motivated you to save them? Kethvar considered this. Over the past 3 weeks, he had watched his adopted children transform from sheltered young beings into passionate advocates for justice. They had thrown themselves into the investigation with an intensity and dedication that reminded him of why he had fallen in love with humanity in the first place. They refused to accept that the galaxy had to be the way it was, refused to believe that power had the right to abuse the powerless simply because it could. They're fighting for the same thing I fought for, he realized. The right of compassion to triumph over politics. The right of families to be defined by love instead of bureaucracy. The right of individuals to choose their own destiny instead of having it imposed on them by distant authorities. Then you succeeded beyond your wildest dreams, Sephrina said. You saved 3 children from death, and they grew up to try to save thousands of children from something worse than death. If that's not a life well lived, I don't know what is. Inside the house, Marcus was working late into the night, refining their presentation for the Zephyrian Council. Elena had fallen asleep over her data analysis, her head pillowed on her arms beside a holographic display showing refugee movement patterns. David was in his room, practicing the speech he would give tomorrow, his voice carrying through the walls as he rehearsed the words that might change the course of galactic history. Looking at his family, Kethvar felt a peace settle over him that he hadn't experienced since this crisis began. Whatever happened in the coming days, whatever the consequences of their challenge to the Council's authority, they would face it together. They had built something worth fighting for, and they had raised children who understood that some things were worth any sacrifice. The Crystal Garden continued its ancient dance of light and growth around them, a living symbol of the beauty that could emerge when different elements combined in harmony. Tomorrow, they would ask the galaxy to embrace that same harmony, to choose cooperation over domination, family over politics, hope over fear. And if the galaxy refused, if the forces of power and corruption proved too strong to overcome, at least they would know that they had tried. At least they would know that 3 children who had once been abandoned and forgotten had grown up to stand before the most powerful beings in the universe and demand that they do better. The moons of Zephyria set behind the Crystal Mountains, and the first light of dawn began to paint the horizon with colors that had no names in any earthly language. In a few hours, everything would change. But for now, in this moment, they were simply a family preparing to defend everything they held dear. And that, Kethvar reflected, was exactly as it should be. The Zephyrian Council chamber had been transformed overnight into something resembling a galactic courtroom. Its normally peaceful crystal architecture now humming with monitoring equipment and communication devices linking it to observers across the galaxy. Representatives from 47 different worlds had requested live feeds of the proceedings, while another dozen had sent official delegations to witness the events in person. What had begun as a simple adoption dispute had evolved into something far more significant. The first formal challenge to Galactic Council authority in over 2 centuries. Kethvar sat in the primary witness chair, his crystalline form reflecting the chamber's bioluminescent lighting in patterns that betrayed his nervousness despite his outward composure. Beside him, Marcus, Elena, and David occupied seats that had been specially constructed for human physiology, their presence in this ancient chamber a symbol of everything their case represented. Behind them, Dr. Youthandra reviewed her research notes one final time, while Sephrina coordinated with Chancellor Vethmaron on the legal procedures they would follow. Across the chamber, the Galactic Council's delegation commanded attention through sheer intimidation. High Arbiter Krexthal, a massive hegemonic whose species had evolved from predatory pack hunters, dominated the opposition table with his presence. His legal team consisted of 12 specialists in interspecies law, refugee policy, and what they euphemistically called cultural stability maintenance. Each carried credentials that represented centuries of experience in enforcing the council's will across the galaxy. This is a formal inquiry into the unauthorized adoption of human refugees by Zephyrian citizen Kethvar Thani. High Arbiter Krexthal began, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that his species used to assert dominance. The Galactic Council maintains that these adoptions were conducted in violation of established protocols designed to protect both the refugees and the receiving society. We seek immediate custody of the human subjects for proper evaluation and placement. Chancellor Vethmaron, her ancient voice carrying the wisdom of 4 centuries of diplomatic service, responded with formal courtesy that barely concealed her anger. The Zephyrian government recognizes no authority superior to our own in matters of internal adoption policy. Citizen Kethvar acted within his rights as defined by our laws and our sovereign status within the Galactic Confederation. Sovereignty that exists only at the pleasure of the Council, Krexthal replied coldly, and which can be revoked when planetary governments demonstrate inability to maintain social stability or protect the welfare of vulnerable populations. Marcus stood slowly, his movement drawing the attention of everyone in the chamber. At 24, he had grown into his role as the eldest sibling, his years of study in Zephyrian crystal technology having given him both intellectual confidence and an understanding of how to present complex information to diverse audiences. With respect, High Arbiter, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, I believe there may be some confusion about exactly who is vulnerable in this situation. You are not recognized to speak in these proceedings, Krexthal stated dismissively. You are subjects of inquiry, not participants. Then, perhaps, Elena said, rising to stand beside her brother, it's time to change the nature of these proceedings. David completed the triangle, standing with his siblings in a gesture of unity that had carried them through every crisis of their lives. We are not subjects. We are citizens. We are family. And we are here to present evidence that the Galactic Council has been systematically violating the rights of beings across the galaxy under the pretense of humanitarian assistance. The chamber erupted in surprised murmurs from the various delegations and observers. Chancellor Vethmaron raised one crystalline hand for silence, her expression showing both pride and concern at this unexpected development. The floor recognizes Marcus, Elena, and David of House Kethvar, she announced formally. They will be permitted to present their evidence and speak in their own defense. Krexthal's reaction was immediate and furious. This is highly irregular. These humans have not been granted legal standing to participate in council proceedings. Their testimony is inadmissible. In a Zephyrian council chamber, Zephyrian law applies, Chancellor Vethmaron replied firmly. And under our law, any citizen accused of wrongdoing has the right to present evidence and testimony in their own defense. That right extends to their family members when the accusations threaten family unity. Marcus activated the holographic display system they had prepared, filling the chamber's central space with data visualizations that immediately captured everyone's attention. Over the past month, we have documented 47 separate incidents where the Galactic Council has used refugee crises as justification for political intervention in sovereign systems. In each case, the intervention coincided with the discovery of valuable resources or strategic advantages. Elena stepped forward to manipulate the three-dimensional data structures, her unique combination of human flexibility and Zephyrian spatial training, allowing her to highlight connections and patterns that would have been invisible in a traditional flat presentation. The timeline correlation is statistically impossible unless the resource discoveries and refugee crises were connected events. The probability of this occurring naturally is approximately 1 in 847 billion. These statistics prove nothing. One of Krexthal's legal specialists interjected. Correlation does not imply causation, and refugee movements often occur in resource-rich systems precisely because economic instability leads to social disruption. David moved to the center of the chamber, his storyteller's training evident in his command of the space and his audience. You're absolutely right that correlation doesn't prove causation. But when you combine these statistical patterns with direct testimony from refugees and council personnel, the picture becomes much clearer. The holographic display shifted to show recorded testimonies from dozens of witnesses, their faces and voices filling the chamber as they described experiences that painted a systematic pattern of abuse and exploitation. Dr. Youthander's research provided the scientific framework, but the personal stories provided the emotional impact that made the data impossible to ignore. One testimony came from a former council administrator who had resigned in protest after witnessing what he described as deliberate destabilization operations designed to create refugee populations that could be used as justification for intervention. Another came from a refugee who had escaped from one of the Reformation centers, describing psychological conditioning techniques that were clearly designed to erase cultural identity and create compliant workers. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from a Kavari mother who had lost her children to the council system and had been searching for them for over a decade. They told me my children were being given better opportunities, education that would prepare them for modern galactic society. I believed them because I wanted my children to have better lives than I could provide. I only learned the truth when I tried to contact them and was told that no records of their identities could be found. They had been given new names, new histories, new families. My children had been erased from existence, replaced by beings who had no memory of their origins. The chamber had fallen completely silent during her testimony, the weight of her loss creating an emotional gravity that affected beings from dozens of different species. Even Krexthal's legal team appeared shaken by the raw pain in her voice. These testimonies, tragic as they may be, do not prove systematic abuse, Krexthal said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Individual cases of administrative error or unfortunate outcomes do not demonstrate institutional malice. Marcus returned to the center of the chamber, his expression carrying a determination that reminded Kethvar powerfully of the protective stance he had taken as a 10-year-old child, defending his siblings in an abandoned colony. You're right. Individual cases don't prove systematic abuse. But when you document thousands of individual cases following identical patterns, when you trace those patterns back to official policies and training programs, when you connect those policies to resource acquisition and political control strategies, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The holographic display showed the full scope of their investigation. Shipping manifests that proved profitable resource extraction following every refugee crisis. Training documents from council reformation centers that explicitly discussed cultural identity suppression techniques, and communication records between council administrators discussing the strategic advantages of maintaining large populations of displaced beings with no political rights or cultural connections. Elena manipulated the data to show the financial flows that connected refugee management to resource extraction, her analysis revealing that the council's humanitarian programs were actually profit centers that generated revenue through both resource acquisition and the provision of cheap labor to council-allied corporations. They're not just destroying cultures and families for political control. They're doing it for money. Furthermore, David added, our own experience proves that their stated justifications are false. We are 3 human beings who were raised in an alien culture without losing our essential humanity. We have contributed to Zephyrian society, learned from Zephyrian wisdom, and maintained our own cultural identity while embracing new perspectives. We are living proof that the integration they claim is impossible actually works when it's based on love and respect instead of force and fear. Dr. Youthandra rose to present her psychological analysis, her scientific credentials lending additional weight to their case. The Council's reformation techniques are specifically designed to create trauma bonding and learned helplessness. They deliberately break down individual identity and cultural connection in order to create psychological dependency on the institutional structure. This is not education or assistance. This is systematic brainwashing on a galactic scale. The delegations from other worlds were clearly affected by the presentation, many of them engaging in urgent conversations with their home governments through encrypted communications. Several have begun taking their own notes, apparently recognizing implications for their own relationships with the Council. Krexthal attempted to regain control of the proceedings. Even if these accusations were true, which we categorically deny, they would not change the legal reality of this situation. These 3 humans were removed from Council jurisdiction without authorization. Their adoptions are invalid under galactic law, regardless of the outcomes. But that's where you're wrong, Chancellor Vethmaran said, rising to address the chamber with the full authority of her position. Because Zephyria formally recognizes these adoptions, and we are prepared to defend that recognition even if it means withdrawing from the Galactic Council entirely. The chamber erupted in shocked responses from the various delegations. Zephyria's withdrawal from the Council would have massive economic and political implications, potentially triggering a cascade of similar actions from other worlds that had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Council authority. You would destabilize the entire galactic order over 3 refugee children. Krexthal demanded. We would defend the principle that love and family are more important than bureaucracy and political control, Chancellor Vethmaran replied. And we would challenge any institution that believes differently to justify its existence. Marcus stepped forward one final time. High Arbiter, you've spent this entire proceeding referring to us as subjects, refugees, and problems to be solved. But you've never once asked us what we want, what we've accomplished, or what we believe. You've never treated us as beings with our own agency and our own rights. That, more than anything else, proves our point about the Council's fundamental approach to dealing with displaced populations. We are not broken beings who need to be fixed, Elena added. We are not dangerous elements that need to be contained. We are not political problems that need to be managed. We are people who found a family and a home and a way to contribute to something larger than ourselves. And if that threatens your authority, then perhaps your authority needs to be questioned. David's final words carried the weight of everything they had learned and everything they hoped to accomplish. You came here today expecting to take us away from our family and return us to your system. Instead, we've presented evidence that your system is built on lies, sustained by abuse, and justified by fear. The question now is whether this chamber, and the worlds watching these proceedings, will choose to support that system or demand something better. The chamber fell silent as the implications of everything they had presented settled over the assembled delegates. 47 worlds had requested feeds of these proceedings, and now they had witnessed not just a family fighting for the right to stay together, but a comprehensive indictment of the most powerful institution in the galaxy. High Arbiter Krexthal looked around the chamber, apparently recognizing that the political dynamics had shifted in ways that his legal authority could not control. The delegations from other worlds were clearly reevaluating their own relationships with the Council, while the evidence presented was already spreading across galactic communication networks. These proceedings are adjourned pending Council review, he announced tersely. The human subjects will remain in Zephyrian custody pending final determination of their status. The human citizens will remain with their family where they belong, Chancellor Vethmaran corrected. And the galaxy will decide whether it wishes to continue supporting an institution that treats sentient beings as property to be managed rather than individuals to be respected. As the delegations began filing out of the chamber, many of them stopping to speak with Keth Var and his family, it became clear that something fundamental had changed. What had begun as a simple custody dispute had become a catalyst for questioning the entire structure of galactic governance. But even as they celebrated this immediate victory, all 5 members of the family understood that the real battle was just beginning. The council would not surrender its authority without a fight, and the consequences of their challenge would ripple across the galaxy in ways none of them could predict. Standing together in the crystal chamber that had witnessed their transformation from refugees to revolutionaries, Marcus, Elena, and David looked toward a future that was both uncertain and filled with possibility. They had proven that love could triumph over law, that family could challenge empire, and that sometimes the most ordinary acts of courage could change everything. The question now was whether the galaxy would choose to follow their example, or whether the forces of fear and control would prove stronger than the hope they had tried to inspire. 3 months after the tribunal, the Galactic Council chambers on Nexus Prime resembled a war zone. Not from physical conflict, but from the complete breakdown of the political order that had governed the galaxy for over 8 centuries. 23 worlds had formally withdrawn from the Council following the release of the evidence presented in the Zephyrian proceedings. Another 15 had suspended their participation pending comprehensive review of Council policies and practices. The remaining member worlds were split between those demanding immediate reforms and those calling for military action against what they termed seditious elements. High Arbiter Krexthal stood before the emergency assembly of remaining council members, his massive frame showing signs of the stress that had consumed him since that disastrous day when 3 human children had systematically dismantled the legal and moral foundations of his authority. The recording of their testimony had spread across every inhabited system in the galaxy, translated into over 400 languages, and viewed by billions of beings who had never before questioned the Council's right to manage their affairs. The situation has become untenable, he announced to the assembled representatives. The Zephyrian incident has triggered system-wide instability that threatens the fundamental structure of galactic civilization. We must take decisive action to restore order before complete chaos ensues. Councillor Vexthera of the Altarian delegation raised one graceful arm to request recognition. High Arbiter, with respect, the chaos you describe seems to consist primarily of member worlds exercising their sovereign right to withdraw from voluntary participation in this body. How exactly does that constitute a threat to civilization? Because without central coordination, without unified policies, without the stability that Council authority provides, these worlds will inevitably descend into conflict, Krexthal replied. The peace we have maintained for centuries depends on clear hierarchies and consistent enforcement of galactic law. The peace you have maintained, interrupted Councillor 2ICH Marin of the Kavari Assembly, appears to have been built on systematic oppression of displaced populations and deliberate destabilization of independent worlds. Perhaps it's time to consider whether such peace is worth preserving. The debate that followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of the Galactic Council. For the first time in centuries, member worlds were openly challenging not just specific policies, but the entire philosophical foundation of centralized authority. The evidence presented by Marcus, Elena, and David had done more than document specific abuses. It had forced everyone to confront the question of whether their system of government was actually serving the beings it claimed to protect. Meanwhile, on Zephyria, the family that had started this revolution was dealing with the unexpected consequences of their success. Their crystal garden had been transformed into an informal embassy, with representatives from dozens of worlds seeking advice on how to restructure their societies without council oversight. Kethvar found himself serving as an unofficial diplomat, helping to coordinate communication between worlds that were attempting to build new forms of interstellar cooperation. Marcus had become something he had never expected to be, a military strategist. Not for warfare, but for the complex logistics of maintaining trade and communication networks as the old council infrastructure collapsed. his mathematical mind, and his understanding of both human and Zephyrian approaches to problem-solving made him uniquely qualified to design systems that could function without centralized control. The key insight, he explained to a gathering of trade representatives from 12 different worlds, is that networks don't require hierarchy. You can have coordination without domination, cooperation without subordination. Human game theory and Zephyrian harmonics suggest similar approaches. Multiple nodes working in concert, with decisions emerging from consensus rather than being imposed from authority. Elena had taken on the role of training coordinator, teaching beings from various species the movement and spatial reasoning techniques that had helped her analyze the Council's data. But more than that, she was helping them learn to think in 3 dimensions about political and social structures, to see connections and possibilities that linear thinking missed. The Council taught everyone to think in terms of vertical hierarchies. She told a group of young beings who were working to establish new forms of planetary governance. Up and down, superior and subordinate, rulers and ruled. But reality is much more complex than that. Power can flow in spirals, in networks, in patterns that change and adapt based on circumstances. Once you stop thinking that someone has to be in charge of everything, you start seeing all the ways that beings can coordinate their efforts voluntarily. David had perhaps the most challenging role. He was serving as the voice of the revolution, the one who helped translate complex political and economic concepts into stories that beings across the galaxy could understand and relate to. His childhood experience as a refugee had given him insights into the emotional reality of displacement and powerlessness that resonated with populations throughout the outer systems. The Council wants you to believe that freedom is dangerous, he said in one of his broadcasts, which are now being transmitted to billions of beings across dozens of worlds. They want you to think that without their oversight, you'll descend into chaos and violence. But look around. Look at what's actually happening. 23 worlds have left the Council, and instead of fighting each other, they're learning to cooperate in new ways. Instead of chaos, we're seeing innovation. Instead of violence, we're seeing communities that are stronger than they've ever been. Dr. Youthandra had established a new research institute on Zephyria, dedicated to documenting the psychological healing of beings who had been damaged by Council reformation programs. Her work was revealing the stunning resilience of sentient consciousness when it was given the opportunity to recover from trauma and reconnect with its essential identity. What we're seeing, she explained in her reports, is that cultural identity is far more robust than the Council believed. Even beings who underwent years of conditioning retain the capacity to remember who they were and to reclaim their authentic selves. The healing process is often difficult, but it's also profoundly hopeful. We're learning that you cannot permanently erase the essential nature of conscious beings, no matter how sophisticated your techniques of control. But the most significant development was happening on a world that none of them had expected, Earth itself. The human homeworld had been under Council administration for over 50 years, its population subjected to the same reformation techniques that had been used on refugee children throughout the galaxy. But as news of the Zephyrian incident spread, something unprecedented began to occur. Humans began remembering. The psychological conditioning that had suppressed their cultural identity started breaking down as they were exposed to stories about 3 human children who had grown up free, who had maintained their essential humanity while embracing alien wisdom, who had proven that humans were capable of growth and cooperation rather than just conflict and destruction. Underground movements emerged in every major Earth city, led by humans who had somehow retained fragments of their original identity and were now working to help others recover their memories. They called themselves the Reclamation, and their growing influence was creating panic among the Council administrators who had spent decades building what they thought was a perfectly controlled society. The situation on Earth is critical, High Arbiter Krexthal announced during another emergency council session. If we lose control of the human homeworld, we lose our primary example of successful species reformation. Other worlds will begin questioning whether their own compliance with Council policies is necessary. But even as he spoke, it was becoming clear that the Council's authority was collapsing faster than they could respond to it. The evidence gathered by Marcus, Elena, and David had provided the framework for understanding Council operations, but the real revolution was being carried out by billions of beings who had simply decided they no longer needed permission to govern themselves. The breakthrough came when 17 worlds simultaneously announced the formation of the Free Systems Alliance, a voluntary confederation based on principles of mutual aid, cultural autonomy, and consensual cooperation. Unlike the hierarchical structure of the Galactic Council, the alliance was designed as a network of equal partners, with decision-making power distributed among all member worlds. Zephyria was invited to serve as the alliance's first meeting place, and suddenly, the Crystal Gardens that had once been a quiet family home became the center of a new form of galactic civilization. Representatives from worlds as diverse as the silicon-based crystallines of Vega Prime and the energy beings of the Proxima Collective gathered to work out the practical details of governance without domination. The irony, Kethvar observed to his family as they watched delegates from dozens of species working together in their garden, is that we set out to save our family and ended up saving the galaxy's ability to form families across species lines. Marcus was reviewing the latest reports from Earth, where the reclamation movement had grown to encompass nearly half the planet's population. It's not just about families, he said. It's about the fundamental question of whether conscious beings have the right to determine their own destiny, or whether that right can be taken away by sufficiently powerful institutions. Elena was practicing a new movement sequence, her body flowing through patterns that combined human flexibility with techniques she had learned from 5 different alien species over the past few months. The Council made a mistake, she said as she moved. They thought that control was the same thing as stability. But real stability comes from resilience, from the ability to adapt and change and grow. You can't create that through force. David was working on a speech he would give to the Alliance Assembly, but he paused to watch his sister's graceful movements. The question now is whether we can build something better than what we're replacing. It's one thing to tear down a corrupt system. It's much harder to create a just one. Which is why, said Sephrina, joining the conversation from where she had been coordinating with Alliance logistical teams, this revolution isn't really about politics or governance. It's about growing up. The galaxy is finally learning that it doesn't need parents to tell it how to behave. It can make its own decisions and take responsibility for its own choices. The final confrontation came not through military action or political maneuvering, but through a simple question posed by a child. During the Alliance's founding assembly, a young Threnodite delegate asked High Arbiter Krexthal, who had come to Zephyria to negotiate the Council's surrender, a question that cut to the heart of everything that had happened. If the Council really wants to help beings throughout the galaxy, the child asked in her piping voice, why does it need to force them to accept that help? Why can't you just offer assistance to those who want it and leave everyone else alone? The silence that followed her question stretched for several minutes. Krexthal looked around the assembly, seeing representatives from worlds that had thrived after leaving Council authority, refugee populations that were healing from decades of trauma, and species that were discovering forms of cooperation they had never thought possible. Because, he said finally, his voice stripped of its usual dominance, we believe that beings were not capable of making good decisions for themselves. We believe that without our guidance, they would choose chaos over order, conflict over cooperation, primitive traditions over progressive advancement. And were you right? Asked Marcus, speaking for the first time during the assembly. Krexthal looked at him, seeing not the frightened child he had tried to claim months earlier, but a young adult who had helped design new forms of interstellar cooperation that were proving more stable and effective than anything the Council had achieved in centuries of authoritarian rule. No, he admitted, we were wrong. About everything. The formal dissolution of the Galactic Council was accomplished through a simple vote. 57 worlds chose to join the Free Systems Alliance, with its principles of voluntary cooperation and cultural autonomy. 12 worlds chose to remain independent, maintaining friendly relations with the Alliance, but preferring to manage their own affairs without any external affiliations. Only 3 worlds voted to maintain the old council structure, and even they agreed to limit their authority to internal affairs rather than